All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Unit 4, Mitosis and Meiosis, aka Cell Growth and Division. In this unit, we're going to talk about how cells grow from a more immature cell to a mature cell, and then ultimately how cells reproduce. And almost the entire time in this unit, we'll be talking about eukaryotic animal cells. So, first and foremost, the question to ask is, why do cells divide in the first place? In fact, instead of just dividing, why don't cells just get bigger and bigger? Why aren't we just one big cell or like a couple big cells? Why are we like trillions of cells? So does this imply there's a limit to cell growth? Well, there are two main reasons why cells divide rather than getting huge. Firstly, the larger a cell becomes, the more demands that are placed on the cell's DNA, right? Remember that very important nucleic acid found inside the nucleus of eukaryotic cells? DNA can only do so much. And if the cell was too big, then that certain amount of DNA found in the nucleus in the form of a chromosome could only do so much for that cell. If the cell grew too large, then that DNA, that amount of DNA, simply couldn't keep up, and the cell would begin to break down, or things in the cell would not get fixed, or the proper proteins would not get made. So there are limits on DNA, and that helps to regulate cell size. Also, if the cell grows too large, it will have trouble moving enough nutrients and waste across the cell membrane. It won't be able to get enough nutrients into itself to keep itself alive, and it won't be able to get enough waste out to keep itself alive. So this is another limit as to why cells divide rather than just getting larger and larger. So let's talk about our DNA, problem number one, having its limits. So all the information that a cell needs to function is stored within DNA. Okay, and we know that DNA ultimately makes all the proteins for the cells. It's like the blueprint for all the proteins, and proteins do everything in cells. And we know that DNA, when in the nucleus, is packaged into these structures called chromosomes. And you can just think of a chromosome as a very long piece of DNA. And on that chromosome, there could be thousands of genes. You could have genes for eye color, skin color, hair texture, height, weight, all of these kinds of things could exist on that one chromosome. Each gene is the instructions for making a particular protein that cell needs. The cell is constantly making copies of these genes and sending the copies in the form of that kind of mysterious nucleic acid we haven't really talked about yet called RNA out to ribosomes. Okay, so that's how that works. DNA makes a copy of itself, basically. We'll get into more of that later. And we call that copy RNA. The RNA is what leaves the nucleus through the nuclear pore and finds the ribosome to make a protein. Remember, DNA can't leave the nucleus. The nucleus is the safe place for DNA, right? We put it in the nucleus in our cells because we don't want it to be damaged. And when the cell is small, the information stored in the cell's DNA is adequate to meet all these needs. Basically, the DNA can make enough proteins fast enough to keep up with the cell, the eukaryotic animal cell, at its current size. If it were to get too large or too big, then DNA couldn't keep up. And as the cell grows too large, if this does happen, which it can and does, we kind of refer to it as an information crisis, right? DNA is genetic information, so this information crisis implies we just don't have the information to keep up with such a large cell and the demands of running it, so the larger cell will die. Now, problem number two, when it comes to this concept of why cells divide rather than getting really, really big, moving nutrients and waste across the membrane. Now let's look at this more detailed. A cell must have a constant inflow of food, oxygen, and water across the membrane, right? Food can be the macromolecules, nucleic acids, lipids, proteins, carbs. We know they need oxygen, right? Cell respiration, that's one of the ingredients to make ATP, and water, right? We know that living things need H2O. So waste products must be going the other way. They must constantly be crossing the membrane in order to leave the cell. So we have a constant influx of materials and a constant outflux of materials. So a larger cell, right, is going to require much more food, oxygen, and water. And a larger cell, as a result, will generate more waste. So as the cell grows, the volume of the cell increases at a much more rapid rate than the surface area of the membrane. Okay, now what I mean by this, let me break this down. Volume means how much can be held within. Okay, and surface area of the membrane is the size of the outer plasma cell membrane, right? Made of lipids. So if that volume on the inside increases at a faster rate than the surface area, the actual outer barrier of the cell, then the cell is going to burst like a balloon. Okay? It's going to burst like a balloon, and it's as simple as that, really. And when the cell also gets too large, because of this inadequate surface area, right, as the volume increases, it gets like bigger and bigger, and the cell membrane is struggling to keep up with its surface area. It doesn't have enough surface area at that point to even transport the large quantities of food, the large quantities of water and waste products in and out. So not only is the cell going to burst, but while it's growing, while volume increases and surface area struggles to keep up, the cell is not getting the waste out that it needs to. It's not getting the amount of nutrients in that it needs to. Just more reason why cells divide rather than grow larger and larger. See you in the next one.